Good morning, I'm Danny Laurel. It is Wednesday, the 4th of March, bringing you Morning Matters because your mornings matter. Let's get to the stories that matter today. Malacanang is preparing a contingency plan to protect the working public from surging fuel costs. President Marcos is considering a request for legislative authority to slash excise taxes on petroleum products. The House deliberations on the impeachment complaints filed against Vice President Sara Duterte continue today. The House Justice Committee is now moving to the next crucial step as they determine whether the remaining complaints are sufficient in substance. And Quezon City Congressman Bong Suntay is under fire for his remarks about actress Ann Curtis during Tuesday's impeachment hearing. Fellow lawmakers branded the comments as sexist and offensive, prompting the committee to strike the statement from the official record.
Nakita ko si Ann Curtis, ang ganda-ganda pala niya. You know, may desire sa loob ko na nag-init talaga. Na-imagine ko na lang kung anong pwedeng mangyari. Pero siyempre, hanggang imagination na lang yon.
Welcome to our program Morning Matters, where we talk about the issues you need to know for the rest of your day. Now, first on the agenda, President Bongbong Marcos says more than 1,400 Filipinos are now requesting repatriation from the Middle East. However, the government cannot do anything for now as airspaces remain closed. Marcos says getting a private plane could also be extremely difficult and dangerous at the moment. There have been cases of misidentification, like in Kuwait, where some American jets had been mistakenly targeted. Land vehicles may also not be spared by attackers. For now, the president tells Filipinos in Arab and Persian nations to please stay put.
Although that will be the best option that we will have in the immediate future. Dahil nga kinakatakutan pa natin yung pagpalipad. So, ang advice na binibigay natin sa ating mga kababayan ay maghanap kayo ng safe place at doon kayo muna at you stay there and you stay in a safe place and stay indoors and stay away from areas of danger.
The president is considering seeking authority from Congress to cut excise taxes on petroleum products if Dubai crude exceeds $80 per barrel. That's as oil prices continue to climb amid the Middle East conflict. Mobile journalist Julie Baiza has this report.
The Marcos administration is looking to ease higher fuel prices as geopolitical tensions in the Middle East show no signs of easing. President Bongbong Marcos is currently studying the possibility of reducing excise tax on fuel and other petroleum products as oil prices are estimated to go up in the coming weeks. The chief executive said he will speak to Congress about the proposal of giving him the authority to lower the excise tax on petroleum products if the price of crude oil exceeds beyond $80 per barrel. The president, however, mentioned that this measure will only be temporary and won't come into play until prices of Dubai crude hit the Fed threshold.
I am going to talk to the leaders in both the House and in the Senate to maybe this is not yet a sure thing, but this is something that we are discussing, and it could be helpful. Is to give me the president the authority to reduce excise tax on petroleum products should Dubai crude exceed $80 per barrel.
Finance Secretary Frederick Go said the administration will still be on a wait-and-see mode before implementing any action on the excise tax suspension.
I'll use earthquake na lang as an analogy so that it's easy for all of you to understand so that we don't overreact. Even an earthquake, for example, of very, very high intensity, but if the earthquake's only 1 second, walang mangyayari. Okay, but a low-intensity earthquake that lasts for, say, 6 hours, tumba ang building. Okay, so it's a combination of price and duration, just like an earthquake, intensity and duration.
At present, oil trading prices range from $77 to $78 per barrel. On Tuesday, March 3rd, local gasoline prices shot up by almost 2 pesos per liter, while diesel had a price hike of 1 peso and 20 centavos per liter. Several lawmakers have already expressed support for Marcos's fuel tax cut push. House Speaker Faustino D. in a statement said the House of Representatives is ready to pass a measure authorizing President Marcos to do so. D said the House is prepared to coordinate with the Senate to review and, if necessary, amend existing laws. Senate President Pro Tempore Ping Lacson also said Marcos's request for emergency powers, once formalized, should be given serious consideration. Lacson explained an amendment of the train law to grant the Department of Finance the authority instead to suspend the excess tax can also be considered. Senate President Tito Soto meanwhile cautioned against rushing the approval of the proposal.
Ang pagkakaalam ko, mayroon pa yatang mga 2 or 3 months na reserve tayo. So ayon sa Pangulo, kung ganun yung statement niya, ang ibig sabihin niyan, kung hindi, ito naman, baka naman hindi tumagal. So we might be worried about something that we should not be worried about at this point. So in the meantime, pag-aralan namin.
Senate Committee on Finance Chairman Sherwin Gatchalian also warned of the repercussions of suspending excise fuel tax. Gatchalian finds it better for the government to top the President's contingency fund.
Ang immediate na nakikita kong kailangan is pwedeng itap ang contingency fund ni Pangulo at least around 3 billion para ma-activate na yung Pantawid Pasada. Ang Pantawid Pasada kasi ngayon, meron ring threshold na 80 billion kaya hindi malabas-labas. So itap mo na yung contingency fund. I think immediately what we can do is to support the PUV drivers. At dito lang sa increase of 15%.
As the President also reported, the country's current reserves of petroleum products remain sufficient. Kapatid Mobile Journal Julie Baiza, We're One News.
Now, with 2 impeachment complaints against Vice President Sara Duterte now declared sufficient in form, the House Committee on Justice is now moving to the next crucial step. Lawmakers will determine whether the complaints are sufficient in substance. Here is that report.
With 2 of the 4 impeachment complaints against Vice President Sara Duterte passing in form, next for the House Justice Committee is to check them for sufficiency and substance. There were 6 grounds to be examined in the Father Saballa et al. Complaint, and ML Party List Representative Leila De Lima, as endorser, itemized Duterte's actions. First, the VP was the most responsible for the supposedly anomalous use of 612 million pesos in confidential funds under the Office of the Vice President and Department of Education. Sara headed DepEd for a while. De Lima said Duterte is culpable of violating the Constitution and betraying of public trust when she committed plunder, malversation, graft, and corruption. But on one of the points, whether or not the Vice President pocketed public funds, the debate became heated.
Pinapakita po na yung 125 million na yon hindi napunta sa dapat puntahan ng such a sensitive funds as confidential or intelligence funds. We can actually say that this were simply appropriated by VP Sara for her personal gain. Kapag hindi napunta dun sa dapat puntahan, at sabi nga sa affidavit ni Ramil Madriaga, ay ito ay napunta sa iba-ibang tao na ano ba sila? Hindi naman sila part of anything. Wala namang sinabi, there was no report, neither the Vice President nor the OVP reported any loss of the 125 million confidential funds. Dahil nga, napunta sa mga ganyan. So that is actually personal gain.
Dito po yung sinasabi, hinahanap po natin kanina yung 125 million. With all the documents, kaya po yung COA naglabas ng AOM, naglabas ng kung ano-ano mga pangalan, na eventually, nakita po natin, yung mga pangalan ay hindi makita ngayon.
The committee also replayed Duterte's November 2024 video when she said she has hired an assassin for President Bongbong Marcos, his wife Liza, and his cousin, then House Speaker Martin Romualdez. The assassin moves if she is killed first. De Lima said this statement was tantamount to conniving to kill, which should not be treated lightly. But for Quezon City Representative Bong Suntay,
lo and behold, they are both alive. So ibig sabihin, walang overt action which was done. You know, sometimes when I go home late, my wife always threatens to kill me. Sabi sa akin ng asawa ko, papatayin kita na eh. Umaga ka na naman umuwi.
With due respect to Congressman Suntay, I do not know if he is lawyering with for the Vice President, because I would even think that he is right now defending her. Pero ito you have seen the video. That amounts to a credible threat against the President, the First Lady, and the Speaker. That is not political noise, just like what he's saying about his wife. What he's saying about his wife is only political noise.
No, but my wife
But
is
that
not a
is not
politician.
political noise, Madam Chair. That is a red flag for national stability and constitutional order.
My husband, he received threats before he was tragically murdered. The threats at first were conditional. Like, if you do this, something will happen. But then, even though they were conditional, the fear and intimidation they caused were very real. Conditional threats can turn into actual harm. Nangyari po yun sa amin. When the VP reportedly made statements implying harm to the President, the First Lady, and the former Speaker, those statements are serious, even if phrased as conditional.
There was also a discussion on whether other statements uttered by the VP could be considered seditious. Duterte once remarked she wanted Marcos's head amputated and that she's not attending one State of the Nation address, and proclaimed herself the designated survivor. Suntay had insisted these could be mere products of the imagination.
Don't go away. We will be back with more stories after this short break. Good morning, I'm Dani Laurel, and here on Morning Matters, we talk about the most pressing issues and give you the context behind the headlines. The House Committee on Suffrage and Electoral Reforms approved a motion to consolidate 25 anti-political dynasty bills into a single working draft. Mobile journalist Arles de los Santos has this report.
Congress have been ignoring the anti-political dynasty provision of the 1987 Constitution for 39 years. Binabaliwala natin. Pero ngayon, mas worse. Bakit? Binabastos natin ang essence ng konstitusyon kung ipapasa natin itong bill na ito.
Caloocan 2nd District Representative Egay Erice aired his frustration on the Committee on Suffrage and Electoral Reforms hearing on Tuesday. That is after Bukidnon 2nd District Representative Jonathan Kit Flores' motion asking to consolidate the 25 anti-political dynasty bills in the House and make House Bill 6771, Speaker Boji this bill as the working draft. Erice's concern is the number of political family members who can run simultaneously in different public posts, saying it is a profanity to what was prescribed by the 1987 Constitution.
Mr. Chair, kung ipapasa po natin itong version na ito po ay hindi anti-political dynasty bill. Dahil ito po mas worst pa sa nangyayari ngayon. Hindi lang po mataba na dynasty ang ipopromote nito, bundat na dynasty ang ipopromote nito.
Under the unnumbered House bill, only one member of a political family up to second degree of consanguinity and affinity can hold a national, provincial, municipal, and barangay post. Or in simpler terms, members of a political family can still sit simultaneously as long as it is not within the same political unit. That triggered members of the minority bloc, including Representative Erice, to withdraw their bills. But House Committee Chair Zia Alonto Adyong is quick to defend their move.
The Speaker's version, which is House Bill 6771, has obtained the biggest number of co-authorships, meaning you you already assumed that these are the ones that are backing up this House version. More than 100 plus.
He also questioned the critics' opinion, calling House Bill 6771 weak.
So for me, I do not understand where does this description come from na mahina. What we can assure you is that this version, we tried to decongest local political unit from a control of one particular family.
But political scientist Julio Tehanqui, who was once invited to the House hearing to elaborate the discussion on political dynasty, said on his online post that the Congress working draft is completely silent on the party system, giving political families a chance to hijack to expand their political influence, calling for people's initiative to a genuine anti-political dynasty law. However, after the hearing, the motion to consolidate the 25 anti-political dynasty House bills has been approved by 22 affirmative votes with 4 abstaining. The committee's goal now is to complete its report on their public consultation and bring the bill to the plenary for debates, hoping for it to reach the third reading. Adjong adds that they cannot be 100% extreme on the House's version of the anti-political dynasty bill, saying it might not be perfect nor acceptable to all the House members, but they have to make do with what they have for now, hoping it might be of any use for the upcoming 2028 elections. Kapatid Arles de los Santos, we are One News.
Let's get more insights on this topic from Dr. Julio Tehanqui, political science professor over at De La Salle University. Good morning, Prof.
Good morning. Good morning, Danny. Thanks for having me.
Prof, let's try to parse through some of the details here. No? Let's take a quick step back in history. So this is 1987, more than 3 decades later. There's a provision, but it requires Congress to still pass this into a law. Why has that provision never happened? Why are we still debating this until today?
Yes. Well, the 1987 Constitution was a product of people power, and it was supposed to consolidate and deepen democracy and restore democracy in our country. And one of the unfulfilled mandates and promises of the 1987 Constitution is Article 2, Section 26, which states that the state shall guarantee equal access of opportunities for public service and ban political dynasties as may be defined by law. And the problem is our Congress is essentially composed of political dynasties. As of last count, 81% of the House is composed of dynasties, and a similar number, 83%, of the Senate is composed of political families related to one another.
What would be the immediate impact if this is finally put into law? I mean, is this going to be happening immediately? Will we be waiting for the next administration? It seems like a massive overhaul, no? Is that even practical?
Well, after 39 years, they have sat on it, and they did not fulfill that mandate by the Constitution. No? It's an order by the Constitution for them to define political dynasty. And after 39 years, and there have been several attempts since 1987 to pass a law to curtail the political monopoly and the powers of the political dynasties. But of course, it was a result of a major crisis from within the ruling elites, the ruling class, and the political dynasties themselves. And this was of course, the flood control scandal, the biggest corruption scandal in our country's history thus far. And it has forced them, because of their, of course, they need to address public indignations and demand by the public to address all of these systemic and structural roots of corruption. And one of them, of course, is political monopoly, the dominance of power in a few political families all over the country. So this has forced even the president to declare the passage of this law as one of the priorities in his LEDAC, no, in his priority bills, no, one of the 21 priority bills, together with the reform of the party list law. So this has given some hope for some, no, and to be fair, despite all the weaknesses, the scandals, and the corruption that happened in the previous year, people were giving them a chance to clean up their own mess. And I think what happened yesterday when the House practically railroaded a particular version of the bill, no, they have failed the call of history. For them, this was a critical moment in which the House could have redeemed themselves and have proven themselves to be real representatives of the people. Unfortunately, they came out with a legislative sleight of hand. No, they tried to use procedure as always, no, to justify the passage of the bill. Danny, there are 25 House bills proposing
Yes.
the
The same thing.
anti-political dynasty law. 25, imagine. And out of the 25 bills, they picked the one that's been the most criticized and has been observed to be the weakest and full of loopholes.
Can we get into that? You critique particularly let's say they didn't put into consideration the fact that you could still run for party list member and you could still be part of a political dynasty in that loophole. What other loopholes or what else has been watered down in this version of the Speaker?
Yes, this is House Bill 6771, authored by Speaker Boji and Majority Floor Leader Sandro Marcos. No, and from the outset, among all the 25 proposed bills, most observers have pointed out that this is the weakest and the most watered down. Why? In the first place, unlike, for example, the version in the Senate that's been approved recently by the committee chaired by Senator Risa Ontiveros, the Senate version, while there are some comments, is a more practicable and negotiable compromise for those who want the maximum position, and the maximum position for civil society and the reform constituency is up to the fourth degree of consanguinity and affinity, both successive and simultaneous, and even to include the party list. No, while in the version of the Speaker's version, which ironically, out of the 25 bills, the committee, after going through the motions, no, going through the process of public hearings and even public consultations outside Manila, and inviting legal luminaries and members of the academe and the reform constituency, still they came up with the weakest despite all these inputs. No? And why is it weak? Well, in the first place, unlike, for example, in the Senate, in which it is clearly stated that the definition of political dynasty shall include national, local elective position, meaning to say everyone in that local position, regardless of separate government units within the local position and the party list. In the version of the Speaker, and now it has been substituted as the working draft, allegedly, they're saying this is just the working draft. This is the beginning. And this is the draft, since it's the Speaker's draft, this is the draft that's been supported by close to 140 members of the House. And yet, what they have done is really just to say only one member of political family can run at different levels of government. National level, House of Representatives, provincial, and in the provincial you have the governor, vice governor, and board members, and then the city and municipal. The problem is only one, but there is no ban on cross-jurisdiction and vertical.
Correct.
So, meaning to
Yes.
say, you can even end up with 12 members of your family legally running, and you're not violating the law. So this,
okay.
if we allow this
Okay.
version,
But is
we
this
will end up.
version at least more stringent than what we currently have without any of this passing? Is there any, because it was mentioned that, I think it was Rep. Erice saying, mas bundat na dynasty ang ipoproduce nito. What does he mean by that? There's going to be more political dynasties with the
More
watered down
dynasty.
version?
In fact, if this version of the bill is passed, this is not an anti-dynasty law. This is a pro-dynasty law. In fact, it will legitimize political dynasties in this country.
But
It
can you
defeats the
clarify that,
purpose.
Prof? Because how does that happen if right now there are no safeguards and then you are putting, at least some are arguing this is the first step, this is not the final step, but it might be very difficult to put in fourth level. But your thoughts on that?
It's not even a question of the degree already. It's a question of the cross jurisdiction and cross constituency, because in a particular province, the collusion, the monopoly happens, and the lack of checks and balances happen when in a particular province the congressman and the governor and the mayor and the vice mayor are all members of the same political family. And that is the source of the problem. By separating these government levels and allowing at least one to run at each level, then what's the purpose of the ban? You're just allowed. One particular section of the House bill is really problematic. Like, for example, item B of section 5, which says spouses or relatives within the second degree are prohibited from simultaneously holding membership in the House of Representatives within the same legislative district. When you read it, it's good. It bans.
Okay,
but Danny, imagine in a legislative district, only one member of the family can actually run. This scenario it might not be impossible, but it's improbable, because no separate members of the same family will contest one legislative.
Each other. Okay.
Yeah.
Unless they are rivals within their own family, which happens also.
There's a family feud. But that's far and in between. So in effect, it's nothing. What
It's
should
what's
be
happening.
what should be the effective provision is that in all legislative districts. So there's a ban in whether it's the provincial, it's the legislative district, or it's the municipal, or just consider it as one local elective office.
Okay, but how can we do that from a practical perspective? Because from the way you're saying it, it's not a function of the degree, 2 degrees, 4 degrees. It's a function of the definition of a political unit. Dapat isa lang. But how practicable is that you only have one member that can run for any throughout? Okay, go ahead. But and what degree are you touting
it's
for?
been ordered by the Constitution, ban political dynasties as may be defined by law, right? So there, from the very beginning, the principle is to ban political dynasties. In fact, they should not exist. If you follow strictly the spirit of the Constitution, ban political dynasties, because that is the source of political monopoly, of corruption, of patronage politics, and clientelism in this country. So the reason why we are where we are, right?
Can we be more academic and define a political dynasty? I mean, you cannot call it a political dynasty if it's 1 or 2 people that have been in office a few years, to the same time. So how can we really zero in? Because I think it's 250 political dynasties, something like that. So not everyone naman is a political dynasty.
Well, that is debatable, Danny. So the simple definition is that, and this is not only from from the academic definition, but it's practically in all the bills filed both in the Senate and the House. Political dynasty is simply the concentration, consolidation, and perpetuation of power in a political family. So if there are more than two, then that's already a political dynasty. It's a political family, right? So there's a need to regulate it. It's a form of monopoly or even oligopoly in the political arena.
Quickly, sir, your last thoughts on what should be the next steps here, because this is already probably going to the plenary, no? And as you mentioned, it was supported already by 1/3 of the House at least.
Well, yeah, of course, the Senate has already begun its own deliberation in the plenary. Today, the minority will pass will try to pass its own alternative as a working draft. And then it will be debated at the plenary, and hopefully more reform-minded members of the House, even if they're members of political families, would support a more principled compromise. And then the final step would be, of course, the BICAM. And what we propose in the Anti-Dynasty Network is that in the House plenary, the members of the House should each explain and, of course, identify their choice. It should be broadcasted. And just like what they did in the budget, there should be an open BICAM for the anti-dynasty law.
All right, so looking forward to that.
The last recourse is for us to push for a people's initiative. The people will be the one to pass a genuine anti-political dynasty law.
Which is still a possibility.
It is a very big possibility. Watch out.
All right. Thank you very much. We will be watching out for that. Dr. Prof. Julio T. Hanqui, Political Science Professor at the De La Salle University and co-convener of the Anti-Dynasty Network. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And stay tuned. Morning Matters will be back after this short break. Welcome back. You are still watching Morning Matters here on One News. Oil prices remain volatile as tensions in the Middle East continue to disrupt global supply. Brent crude hovered near $80 per barrel in overnight trading, while U.S. benchmark WTI traded around $73.80. Prices had surged more than 8% on Tuesday following drone strikes on key Saudi and UAE energy facilities. With prices now past the $80 threshold, Philippine officials may move to suspend or reduce excise taxes on fuel to cushion the impact on consumers. This as local fuel prices increased anew. Now, oil companies raised gasoline prices by 1 peso and 90 centavos per liter, diesel by 1 peso and 20 centavos, and kerosene by 1 peso and 50 centavos. This marks the 8th straight week of increases for gasoline and the 10th for diesel and kerosene. Energy Secretary Sharon Garin assured the public that the country has enough fuel supply despite the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. In an interview with The Big Story, Garin said current petroleum reserves are expected to last for around 60 days. However, she cautioned that fuel prices remain volatile as any adjustments will depend on global market movements and further developments in the region. She added that any decision on suspending fuel excise taxes will be left to the government's economic team for careful assessment.
On the supply, hindi na problema yan because we have enough time because instead of 15 days, meron tayo mga halos 60 days to supply. So we have enough supply for fuel. The price naman, it's just inevitable. Price is not really something that Philippines can control because we import most of our fuel.
And joining us now to talk about this is Angelo Taninco, Research Head and Chief Economist of Security Bank. We will get his insights on the latest global oil price movements and what this means for the Philippine economy and the stock market. Good morning, Angelo.
Good morning, Dan. Thank you for having me.
All right, Angelo. So we've seen the prices, the oil prices hitting $80 per barrel already, but it has come down a little bit. It's now hovering around 70, between 70 and 80. What is the risk here, and what are the immediate actions that you believe should be taken to protect the economy from this?
Well, indeed, the global oil prices continued to be tilted to the upside. I think last night we saw again another round of military retaliation in the Middle East between U.S. And its allies, as well as Iran. So oil prices have gone up, I think, for 4 straight days already. And if I'm not mistaken, the Brent as well as Dubai have already topped $80 per barrel. So clearly, there is a need for the countries around the world, especially importing countries like the Philippines, to cushion these price effects coming from oil. And we think that the government is on track to provide the safety nets needed in order to temper the adverse impacts of these oil price hikes.
You are clear on that uptrend, that there's still upside risk and it will probably stay above $80 per barrel?
Yes.
Okay, which is already the threshold, no, that was mentioned by PBBM himself on whether to review the excise tax issue. Give us an idea on how the economy will be impacted in the very short term just by this. We already saw fuel hikes in the pump prices, but there are also talks that we have 60-day reserves. The prices will be at a staggered level. The excise taxes might also be cut. Is this going to be enough for the karaniwang tao to be able to do their normal work?
Clearly, the Middle East conflict is a headwind to Philippine economic growth. This is because, one, the surge in oil prices will raise oil import costs, and therefore that will be negative on our trade performance because this will tend to widen the merchandise trade deficit. Furthermore, we have seen already disruptions on international shipping routes as well as the travel in the Gulf states. And therefore, that will hurt our exports of goods as well as services. And that will constrict export performance, further widening the trade deficit. And the trade deficit widening is negative to the Philippine GDP growth. Likewise, domestic demand will likely be adversely impacted because inflation is on the rise. Of course, later this week, we'll have the February inflation print, which does not yet take into account the oil shock. But we are already seeing a potential upside surprise on the February inflation because we peg it at 2.6% versus the consensus of 2.4%. But for this month of March, because oil prices have already breached $80 per barrel globally, then we will not be surprised if CPI inflation will top 3% for this month alone and could track higher in upcoming months for as long as the Middle East conflict prolongs. And as a consequence, this could dampen consumer spend, which accounts for 70% of our GDP, because of the higher inflation that we will see over the near term as a result of the crisis in the Middle East.
We'll get back to you on the inflation story, but just to get your reaction here on the Department of Energy saying that we have different sources to import our oil, particularly crude oil, so we're not completely dependent on the Middle East. How confident are you about that statement?
Well, indeed, there is an inventory of about 2 months' worth for our oil. However, in terms of the sentiment that is being afflicted by this crisis, we could also have a dampening of both consumer and business sentiment as early as this month of March and in upcoming weeks and months. And that also could drag our economic growth. So indirectly, despite having sufficient energy buffer for now, there are other effects that could manifest from the Middle East crisis that tend then to be negative. So aside from oil, for example, you could also see a hike in shipping costs. In fact, the Philippine Ports Authority already mentioned that there could be an upswing in freight costs as a consequence of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which accounts for 20% of the world's energy supply. So for as
Right.
long as you have those kinds of shutdowns on our shipping routes and also the travel is being dampened as well, then we believe that these overall disruptions on international trade flows will raise supply costs because the raw material costs will also be elevated. Plus the fact that you have the peso already weakening as well, the dollar peso settling at 58.4 already
Yeah.
yesterday, and that will likewise be a burden for importers moving forward.
Should the Philippines suspend excise taxes? This is not the first time we've seen this situation. We saw it also in the pandemic, and it's very, very difficult because then you lose a bunch of revenues for the government as well, which we've already seen in last year's growth print. We weren't able to spend. The government wasn't really spending, and this hampered growth. And we do have, a debt to GDP ratio that's increasing that we need to be financing here. So what's the next step that should be taken? You've also got Senator Gatchalian saying let's use other funds muna before we start suspending taxes.
Well, I think that as mentioned, we have already experienced this before, having an emergency suspension for the excise tax on petroleum. But this ought to be temporary because there are foregone tax revenues from it, as mentioned by the senator. There could be, foregone tax revenues of about 30 billion pesos per month, or more than 300 billion pesos per year if you have a prolonged suspension of the excise tax. So to me, I think it ought to be temporary for as long as we go through this challenge from the oil price shock. But then again, we think that the oil price shock would, of course, wane. But that is conditional on the fact that you have a stop in the conflict in the second quarter, potentially, because President Trump mentioned 4 to 5 weeks timeline for his military offensive against Iran. So, however, as you pointed out, the debt to GDP is already relatively high. I think the highest in 20 years for now. Yesterday, we saw the budget deficit print for 2025. It's relatively narrowed compared to 2024 at 5.6% of GDP. And that's because the revenue growth weakened. I think it was flat. So that again shows that there is likewise a need for us to bolster our tax revenue effort. And that will be more challenging, especially if we have a temporary suspension of the excise tax on petroleum.
Angelo, let's go back to the inflation story here. We've had quite tempered inflation until this issue happened, right? And in fact, the BSP has been in an easing cycle. There was a lot of bets that there would be one final rate cut on April at least. What is the scenario that you're looking at for the rest of the year, given these developments? And how do you think the BSP is going to be managing monetary policy?
Before this war occurred last weekend, we have already penciled in a higher inflation print this year at 3.1%. But this assumes that the global oil prices stayed at around $70 per barrel.
Okay.
Now we've seen at least a $10 jump for now. If that persists, then we will likely revise upward our inflation forecast. And because as we have seen back in 2022 when the Russia-Ukraine war erupted, inflation topped the target range. I think it was close to 6% at that time. So clearly, it's inflationary, the oil price shock, as well as the conflict in the Middle East. So at the same time, our House view for monetary policy is that after February 19th cut, we do not expect any more cuts for the rest of the year. And I think this is augmented by the fact that inflation expectation is now on the rise because of this oil price hikes that we are going to see locally as well, because of course we are heavily dependent on oil imports.
Angela, you mentioned something quite jarring there, 6% inflation, and that just reminded our viewers here during the Russia-Ukraine, invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Give us an idea, how is this comparable? Are we going to be seeing something at these levels?
Well, in terms of the spike in geopolitical risk, in fact, the spike there is much sharper now versus in Russia-Ukraine war back in 2022. And this is evident in an index called the Geopolitical Risk Index that we closely track as well. So yes, it's comparable. And the question now is whether this will be short-lived or whether we can see months of conflict and heightened geopolitical risk. So for us, we believe that for as long as the geopolitical risk remains elevated, then global oil prices would remain elevated, especially if that risk is emanating from oil-rich states like those in the Gulf area. And hence, inflation risk is much higher now, and the chances that it might even go closer towards the upper bound of the target range or even breach it has increased as well in light of that the tension arising from the oil-rich region.
What is your outlook on the peso for the short term?
Well, for the short term, we think that the dollar peso will be between 58 and 59. Although there is, of course, some expectation that it might eclipse 59 if we see oil prices, say, go up further, closer towards $100 per barrel. But we have enough external buffers in terms of foreign reserves. So we believe that the foreign reserve will be enough in order to temper any sharp peso depreciation, which is unwarranted because that also constitutes excessive volatility in the exchange rate, which would also hamper businesses in terms of their confidence and investment if this will be not managed well.
Which sectors are most impacted here? And are there going to be some sectors that will be perhaps resilient in this situation?
Well, clearly it's going to be the manufacturing sector. We saw, of course, the first 2 months of the year, strong performance.
Correct.
When we look at manufacturing PMI.
Tech.
But starting this month of March and in upcoming months, we could see that PMI number to pull back because the orders of manufactured goods and the production will pull back as well because in light of this crisis. So the manufacturing sector, which is also very much a tradable sector, will be hit by the supply chain disruption and the high shipping cost associated with this crisis.
Okay, so apart from the usual transport, even food, no, because of the fuel cost to just transport the food and all of these things, electricity prices will be shooting up as well. I want to get some of your insights on the rest of the issues apart from the oil. What should we be watching out for from an economic standpoint? How are we impacted by this ongoing war? Are we going to be impacted in terms of external trade? As you mentioned, you already mentioned the manufacturing sector. The fact that we have 2.5 million OFWs working there, remittance is going to be hit. What other things need to be considered here apart from the oil story?
Well, the oil shock that we are experiencing has, multiple effects, and that spans across various sectors. So manufacturing is one, but as you mentioned, food is another. So the agricultural sector will also be negatively affected. There's also the services side. So indeed, you have transport and storage, logistics. But also to point out that once you have remittance slowing down from the Middle East, that could also hurt the domestic consumer spend and even the property sector, which depends also on the OFW remittances, may also feel the pinch when it comes to this, slowdown on remittances. So overall, you could see more risks occurring on the balance of payments of the Philippine economy because you have not just trade deficit widening on both goods on the good side, the surplus on the trade services could also shrink because you have export of travel services being hampered. Likewise, foreign investments might be curtailed because you have a low investor confidence. In fact, we now see stock markets around the world going down. So that showcases that the investor sentiment has been hurt as well by this crisis. So lack of foreign investments will also translate into a widening of the balance of payments deficit. And that would push also more pressure on the local currency to depreciate. So our year-end target of 58.6 for the dollar peso is still intact, but we also see now more upside risk to our dollar peso target as we have a more prolonged crisis in the Middle East, and if this is not contained anytime soon.
Are you in a position to give us a growth estimate?
Well, we currently have a 5% GDP growth estimate for the Philippines, and that I think is
5%?
within 5% for this
Okay.
year. But a sub 5% in the first 2 quarters of the year. And that is also because of the low business confidence that's coming from the crisis. So a slower pace of growth recovery is still our baseline view, and we're banking on the second half of the year to have a accelerated recovery, and that assumes that this crisis that we are seeing from the Middle East is put to a stop before the second quarter ends. If not,
Okay.
then we'll likely revise lower our forecast because several months of oil shock would be, I think, would have a more consequential effects on our domestic economy.
Okay, but still higher than last year's print. So that's
Yes.
still a quite positive development there, considering you've already taken into account the risks of this war, the downside risks on that. Thank you so much for your insights, Angelo Taninco, Research Head and Chief Economist over at Security Bank. Meanwhile, PLDT is offering free call services to help overseas Filipinos stay in touch with their families amid rising tensions in the Middle East. PLDT Chairman and CEO Manny Pangilinan announced a 24/7 crisis hotline to connect affected Filipinos with their loved ones. The number is +632 8845 7799. Through this number, Filipinos in the Philippines can call family members in countries including Iran, Israel, Iraq, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia at no cost. Filipinos in these countries can also make free calls to the Philippines via the Tinbo app using a smart virtual number. In other news, Quezon City 4th District Representative Bong Suntay drew criticism for his remarks about Ann Curtis during a House Committee on Justice hearing on impeachment complaints against Vice President Sara Duterte. These comments came as Suntay defended Duterte's earlier statement in which she said she had, quote, imagined cutting off President Bongbong Marcos's head.
Minsan, nasa Shangri-La ako, nakita ko si Ann Curtis. Ang ganda-ganda pala niya. may desire sa loob ko na nag-init talaga. At na-imagine ko na lang kung anong pwedeng mangyari. Pero siyempre, hanggang imagination na lang yon. Pero, di naman siguro ako pwedeng kasuhan dahil kung ano-ano yung na-imagine ko eh.
In an interview with One News's Storycon, Suntay called his remarks an, quote, analogy and said he saw nothing immoral or illegal in them. When asked if he should apologize, Suntay said the actress should take the comment as a compliment.
That was an analogy. If you feel that what I said was immoral, then I would like to ask which particular word was immoral. Sabi ko, ang ganda-ganda niya. And I think she should take it as a compliment that I feel and I believe that she's very beautiful.
Well, that wraps up today's episode of Morning Matters. We hope we have given you just the right start to your morning. Let's now make the day matter. I'm Dani Laurel, kapatid. We are One News, all sides, all the time.